Welcome everyone to the 2021-2022 Hive Intern Showcase. This is a great time of year, and this is the sixth time that we've run these sessions. The Hive Intern, the Hive Internship scheme is a really great way for academics to connect with very capable students and engage and participate in projects that involve visualization, involve a particular discipline area, and it's within the 10 weeks of the program. It's a very good opportunity to produce a lot of good work towards a particular topic. They are research projects, so it's not just cranking the handle, doing some data processing. It is really something that actively connects with a research project, and that's why an academic is the project lead. And the 9 students that we've had this year have been really working hard, and it's really great for them to all be here today to showcase their projects. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting here today on Indigenous lands, and pay respects to their leaders. The students have, under the scheme, been receiving a scholarship. This is not one of those internships where they've got to invest their time and money into a scheme. We are actually paying them. Many of them are sponsored by an external organisation or another group within the university. In this first batch, we've got one of the projects has been sponsored by an external organisation, and another by one of the disciplines here in the university, and I'll mention those as we go through the day. How are we going for time? We're running a little bit behind, but there's a few important things to mention. As you will have experienced as you came in, this is a declared venue, so we do need to check vaccine certificates, etc. Masks are required at all times. The speakers have the option of removing their mask if they want, because they're presenting to a large group. As you can hear, we've got good audio support. Each of the interns will give you a lapel microphone, and I'll use this one as well. We are recording these sessions, so don't say anything too controversial. And so we do have a live streaming audience, and we might have some questions that come in from the chat of the YouTube channel as well. So for those of you who are watching online, please, if you do have any questions, just enter them into the chat. If you're here in the audience, just put your hand up at the end, and as long as the students haven't gone too long in their presentations, we'll have time for questions. We'll just now be running 10 minutes late compared to these timings, and we'll just make that up in the break time and start the session 2 at the regular time. Hopefully our technical problems are all settled now. We actually had 2 lots of technical problems this morning, but in such a high-tech facility, that's just something we've learnt to live with. There's always something that doesn't go quite as we'd expected, and many of you will be familiar with the phrase, "Have you turned it off and on again?" Well, we use that all the time. It's not just for the TV program. All right, so our first presenter is Jade Geerlingsbat, and her project is supported by the discipline of Medical Radiation Science HDR Fund. I think that's right. In fact, I've got it written right down here so I can actually refer to it. Her primary supervisor is Professor Jonghwa Sun from the discipline of Medical Radiation Science in the Curtin Medical School, and along with co-supervisors Anshu Gupta and Colin Harrison. And Jade is studying a health science degree in radiology. It lists PhD here, but is that correct? No, I didn't think so. I'll ignore what is in this last column, just in case. Future PhD student. Her presentation will be on enhanced visualization of normal anatomy with augmented reality superimposed on 3D printed models. And she has some props that she will be using as well. So just a reminder of how this will work. Each of the students gets a 20-minute block for presenting, which is normally about 15 minutes for presentation, 5 minutes for questions. We have 3 students, so that's about an hour. And then at the end, let me hold this microphone in front of my mouth, and then at the end we have the demonstration. So each of the students will be sort of peel along off into a different area of the room, and depending upon what takes your fancy, you can visit one of them or all of them, and I think that's for about half an hour, so there should be enough time for you to see and experience their visualizations. So Jade, would you like to come up, and I'll get the microphone set up for you.
Cool. So, hello everyone. My name is Jade. I'm studying radiography here at Curtin. And this is my project, Project 22, where we used enhanced visualization of, we created enhanced visualization of normal anatomy with augmented reality superimposed on the 3D models. Would you prefer I take my mask off? Okay. Getting some confused looks. Okay, so understanding anatomy is essential for almost every healthcare profession. And learning about anatomy can be sometimes a lifetime affair for some anatomists. Experienced anatomists will spend years mastering their art. Usually, learning anatomy begins with exposure to videos and diagrams, but only so much can be taken from these tools. Then we have cadaveric specimens. So wet and plastinated models, which can be used to demonstrate more accurate human anatomy, because that's about as close as we can get to real-life, living human tissue. But that comes with a few problems. So storing and working with cadavers can be expensive. It requires licensing. There must be significant ethical considerations. It relies on bequeathment, and so cadavers aren't always available. And sometimes they just aren't available for people to use in their learning environment. So some universities even may not have access to cadavers. And because of the sensitivity to work with cadavers, students' learning experiences are not always the most interactive or immersive. So one way to overcome this is with a tool that I've created, or a tool that we've created, which enhances the visualization of anatomical structures with new technology. So this was my method. I was supplied with, is there a laser pointer? There it is. I was supplied with a high spatial resolution MRI dataset. So this was one sequence that took about 25 minutes to acquire, which is way, way longer than your average MRI takes. Usually one sequence is a couple of minutes. So because it's such a long acquisition time, the quality is way, way higher than normal. But that was absolutely necessary to achieve the desired level of accuracy for this project. So then I plugged that piece of data into a piece of open source software called 3D Slicer, where I segmented the bones and soft tissue. So that basically just means I created virtual models using the dataset as a template. So I could tell the program what were my structures of interest and what wasn't. So I segmented the bones and muscles. The bones went off for printing. The muscles went into another piece of software called Unity, where we sorted out all of the interactive side of things and the tracking and all of that for the actual visualization. So this is what one kind of MRI looks like. This is one specific type of sequence. We have muscles looking pretty grey up here. Tendons are black. Bones and fat are white. And that caused a bit of drama for me when it came to segmenting, because I couldn't just rely on the greyness of the pixels to segment. And that's a problem because virtually every automatic tool that 3D Slicer provides relies on the grey levels. So when I tried to tell the computer, okay, I want bones, so I'm going to say everything that's white is bone, but it just gave me the whole foot. So I had to do extra work to tell it what was bone and what was fat. So the way I got around that was by using a tool called Fill or Grow with Seeds, where I'd really crudely paint areas in here which were my structure of interest. So I'd tell it, yep, I want all of this structure. Every few slices, I'd paint those dots in, and then I'd paint around it and say, hey, this is not my structure of interest, with a different color. And it could work out pretty accurately as well what was my structure of interest. So that's a bone called the talus in the ankle, and what wasn't. And for the most part, it worked pretty well, but I did have to smooth it out a bit in the end, because it did give me some extrusions and intrusions that I didn't want. So I just used what's called an averaging kernel, which is like just a smoothing brush. It averages out the pixels, and I could just smooth out everything that I didn't want, all the inaccuracies. As for the muscle segmentation, that was a whole different ballgame. Shades of grey, yeah, the thresholding didn't work very well for that either. So every few slices, I would paint on the cross-section on the muscle of interest. So I'd paint it, move down a few slices, paint it again, and it would interpolate for me. I could tell it to fill in those gaps. And that is pretty much how it looked after that. So there still are some inaccuracies. You can see it kind of looks a bit fluffy, a bit spiky. So I had to do what I did with the bones and smooth it out with averaging kernels and paint in the holes myself. So that was the most time-consuming part by far. Another thing that made it super time-consuming, though, was the fact that when I studied anatomy in first year, we did not go into that much detail for a structure like the foot, for a region like the foot, I should say. We didn't go into every discrete muscle layer, so I had to refer back to my anatomy textbook for that one, which in itself took quite some time. So when it came time to print my bones, I printed it at a few different places. Zhonghua was kind enough to have contacts in all of these places. So one prototype was printed in my building in 301. Just a small one, could fit in your hand, super delicate though. There was an accident, I lost a toe. 3 models were printed in Malaysia. So one super cool flexible one was printed. You guys would have seen that one. So I'm never going to break that one. I should have brought it with me today, but unfortunately not. And I also had got 2, I think it was printed in PLA, polylactic acid. That's the yellow one that you guys saw. Super light, but the only problem with that is it's printed on a kind of matrix, and so, yeah, yeah, Carly drops it by accident and breaks it. No, but yeah, it's super delicate, so that has its own problems. Super light, but super delicate. I also had one other one printed in a type of resin with pins connecting to it and a base, so it was really structurally sound, really strong. Yeah, that was a good one. So that's the one here. So then we plugged it into Unity. My musculature was imported, all the virtual models were imported as assets, and for the most part of this step in my method, I used prefabs from open source packages from something called Vueforia, and the mixed reality toolkit provided by Microsoft, specifically for developing applications for the HoloLens 2. So this is where all of the interactive side of things came about. So we created the UI and buttons and all kinds of things that you can interact with, for example, to display specific layers. So if you wanted to visualize a deeper layer in the foot, but you didn't want your view to be obstructed by the superficial structures, you can turn off those superficial structures so that you get a better view. Same said for the labels. So there's like 20 or 30 odd labels. If you have them showing all at once, it's kind of overwhelming, so you can turn some of them off. And that can be really handy as well if, say, you wanted to test your knowledge. So you could turn off the labels, say, oh yes, that is Flexor digitorum longus. And then you could turn the labels on and see if you got it right. So this is the model target generator. So we scanned my 3D printed model with Carly's phone using an app and imported it. And this is basically how Unity was going to decide where the HoloLens was going to decide where my 3D printed model was. So it could track and map the soft tissue over the top and keep it superimposed regardless of where it is. So if you turn it over, it rotates as well. All of the musculature rotates as well. Yeah, so this is the program we used. So future work. One significant limitation of my project is that we only created a model of the foot and ankle. So theoretically, you could apply this approach to any other region in the body. If you wanted to do it on the knee or shoulder or hand, you could use the same method. We could also create models with movable joints, but this would require significant anatomical knowledge. So you'd have to be aware of exactly what axes the joints move in. So you don't want to be making every joint under the sun a hinge joint, because that would be wildly inaccurate. You would need really in-depth knowledge to make sure that your printed models really demonstrated how the anatomy works in real life. Another thing you would need if you took that approach was you would need to be able to animate your muscles. So as you're flexing or extending a joint, you would need to be able to make it look like those muscles are contracting and relaxing. So that would be another consideration if you took that approach. And of course, these models only included muscles, tendons, and bones. There are so many other structures around the body: fascia, nerves, vasculature. Yeah, so you would need other data sets as well, potentially, to do something like that. Maybe an angiogram if you wanted to get those blood vessels in. So yeah, that's another way we could advance this project. And the impact, we have potentially made a more accessible teaching tool, that provides an immersive, interactive learning experience. And the overarching goal is to improve learning outcomes and potentially make more knowledgeable students and health professionals. And I'd just like to say thank you to all of these lovely people, to Professor Sun for helping me with this project in general, Dr. Gupta and Mr. Harrison for providing me with the data set, Ms. Tillett out the back there for helping me with all the technical stuff, Associate Professor Lee for providing me with the laptop I've been using. I would be so lost without it. And Mr. Lim, Dr. Wong, and Mr. Duck for printing all my models. Are there any questions?
Okay, our next presenter is Grace Jones. So Grace, if you could come up, please. So Grace is doing a Bachelor of Commerce with honours and is planning to enrol in a PhD in this year. Is that right?
Not this year, but maybe eventually.
I'm not going to believe anything on this last column here. Everything comes with a question mark there. Grace is being supervised by a little bit too loud, Associate Professor Katharina Wolf and Bridget Tomlinson from the School of Management and Marketing. Her topic is Spatial Mapping, the Evolution of Global Social Movement, and specifically the Black Lives Matter movement. Let's go.
Brilliant. Okay, can everyone hear me? Perfect. Okay. Good morning, everyone. As Andrew said, my name is Grace. The last column was a little bit of a lie, but so I'll introduce myself. I did my undergraduate in communications, which was actually within the Bachelor of Arts. And then I swapped over to commerce for my honours year so that I could pursue research in public relations and social movements. So I'm very passionate about those two things and kind of bringing them together, and that's what my research focused on. And I will be graduating next week, so that's very exciting. Thank you very much. I had the pleasure of being supervised by Dr. Katharina Wolf, Bridget Tomlinson, and Carly Tillett, and I'm very excited to be presenting my Hive internship project with you all. So, as Andrew said, I did spatial mapping of Black Lives Matter. So what that included was bringing together various data sets, including hashtag data, protest data, deaths in custody, and legislative changes, and putting it together on an interactive and immersive scrolly telling story. So this means that the viewer is kind of guided through the story of Black Lives Matter, and I can bring up different data sets and different stories and pictures, kind of how I want the audience to do it. But there are interactive elements like pop-ups so that they can explore deeper as they see fit. So just before I kind of jump into my presentation, I want to get an understanding of, I guess, what everyone knows about Black Lives Matter. So can I have a quick raise of hands if you've heard of Black Lives Matter? Awesome. And can you keep it up if you actually know how it started? Okay, a few people, that's okay. Then I can tell you a little bit about it. So on the 26th of February in 2012, Trayvon Martin, which is there on your left, he was walking home from 7-Eleven. He was walking home in a gated community called The Retreat at Twin Lakes. He's a 17-year-old boy, and he's visiting his father and his father's fiancée. As he's walking in this community, George Zimmerman, a white neighborhood watch captain, sees him and decides that he doesn't belong in that community. He rings the non-emergency 911 dispatch and tells them there's a suspicious male in here and he doesn't belong here. He then tells the dispatcher, I'm following him, and they say, okay, we don't need you to do that. But he continues to follow him, and eventually there's a struggle. 5 people called 911, and you can hear a young male screaming help. Eventually he stops screaming because you hear a gunshot, and Trayvon Martin, the 17-year-old, was killed in the gated community where he was staying. A year later, George Zimmerman is acquitted for all charges. He's found not guilty of murder and not guilty of manslaughter. So one black woman, like many others actually, Alicia Garza, she took to Facebook to express her heartbreak, her outrage, and her disappointment in the justice system. And she finishes her status with Our Lives Matter. Her friend, Patrice Collers, replies to the status and comments, hashtag Black Lives Matter. And that's kind of where the movement began. This movement has maintained notoriety since 2013 when it was founded, but it reached new heights in 2020 when George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man and father, was arrested in Minneapolis. He was handcuffed, pinned to the ground, face down, and police officer Derek Chauvin kneeled on George Floyd's neck until he died. In bystander footage, you can hear George Floyd screaming, I can't breathe, and yet 4 police officers who were present allowed Derek Chauvin to continue kneeling on him and did not administer first aid, even when they couldn't feel his pulse. Naturally, and I'm sure many of you have heard of it, this video went viral on social media. So I'm from public relations, and you might be wondering how that has anything to do with social movements or Black Lives Matter. I know the PR kind of has a reputation for being spin doctors or kind of stepping in when there's a crisis and really being about protecting a large corporation's reputation. But as I've learned at Curtin, PR is so much more than that. Public relations is strategic communication, it's community building, and most importantly, it's storytelling. Black Lives Matter is one of the richest global stories that there is in the modern world, and it has been told across social media. So this has been a brilliant learning opportunity for myself and other public relations professionals. Activism, social movements, it's a great way for us to understand the world, understand our audience, and understand our role in social change. Coming into this project, I had 3 objectives. The first one was to tell the story of Black Lives Matter from a global perspective, because public relations literature has often focused on the US, and it has largely, been dominated by that, and there are other parts of the world are quite underrepresented. Black Lives Matter in particular has only been studied from the US when it comes to public relations literature. And any scrolling stories like what I've done have been, again, focused in the US. So I really wanted to capture the whole world and kind of what that story looks like in different parts of the world. I also wanted to explore the organic growth of Black Lives Matter and see kind of what key events led to its expansion, and whether that was something like social media, key deaths that really gained notoriety, legislative changes, kind of capture it all and see how it's grown over the years, over space and time. So that's where the multiple layers of data come in, so I can really get kind of a cohesive and comprehensive insight into the movement. So these are kind of the steps I took in this project. Of course, first one, background research, finding out what's missing in the picture of Black Lives Matter, and that's where I determined the research objectives. My data collection included kind of finding different databases of information, so hashtag data, protest data, legislative changes in the US, and deaths in custody in the US. From there, I had to create a storyboard. So that's kind of the old school version, pictures and the text that goes with it, so that I could really map out what story I wanted to tell. Then I needed to import the data sets into this really fun software called Mapbox. I had a lot of it was a great opportunity to learn how to use Mapbox. It was a bit of a learning curve. I'm really glad that I did it with the Hive. And then from there, there's something called Mapbox storytelling, and that's where you kind of code and then decide which data sets or layers you want to bring up from Mapbox into the whole scrolly telling story. And then you have to test Mapbox storytelling on different screens, because it always resizes depending on the size of the screen, so it looked very different on my laptop compared to this screen. And with that comes editing. So what did I find in my project? Well, the first thing I wanted to look at is whether, I wanted to look at how many Black Americans have been killed by the police in the US, because I think it's really important to establish that, yes, this is a real issue, and that's why the movement exists. So since 2013, 2,496 Black Americans have been killed by police, and this number is said to be, underestimated, because reporting in the US by police departments is very low. So I had to rely on crowdsourced or non-government databases to find this number. And some of the people that have been killed by police are very young, like Tamiya Rice. He was 12 years old when he was shot and killed by police because he was playing with a toy pellet gun, and they shot him within 2 seconds of arriving to the scene. And then I looked at hashtag data. So in May 2020, when George Floyd was murdered, hashtag Black Lives Matter was used over 2 million times on social media. And you can see that this hashtag is used all over the world. It's not just in the US, but kind of everywhere was engaging with it, and quite intensely. Twitter was used by journalists, like in the middle, to share kind of their perspectives, as well as people who were kind of engaging in citizen journalism, where they were sharing their on-the-ground experiences and kind of telling the world that way. I found that Black Lives Matter may be the largest movement in US history. So this is, was found by the New York Times. They found that 15 to 26 million people likely participated in protests in June 2020 alone. And that makes Black Lives Matter bigger than the civil rights movement in the height, at its height in the 1960s. It makes it bigger than the anti-nuclear movement in the 80s and bigger than protests against the Iraq War. But it's not just massive in the US. I think Black Lives Matter reached all over the world. There were over 10,000 protests in 2020 alone that focused on Black Lives Matter or used Black Lives Matter messaging. So where we are in Perth, on the left, we had 3 rallies in June and July of 2020. And in Perth, we not only stood in solidarity with people in the US, but we really focused on Indigenous deaths in custody and what Black Lives Matter means to people in Perth and in Australia. And it also reached places like South Africa, where there is obviously a large Black population, and they could, again, really empathise with Black Lives Matter and have similar shared experiences. I think a really important thing for me was finding out what impact Black Lives Matter has had. It isn't just a social media movement. It's a real, tangible movement, and it has achieved real change. So from 2020 in May onwards, 25 or more states have brought in legislation that bans the chokehold, that prohibits certain uses of force, that makes body cameras mandatory, and also brings in more stringent checks for people who are applying to the police. So they look for things like racial bias now. And those are things that have happened since George Floyd was murdered. So bringing all of my findings together, what does this mean? I think that I found that Black Lives Matter has created kind of a globally connected story, and that we are all connected by shared experiences and shared values. I think I've also kind of found that engaging with social media movements is not just slacktivism, which is a really common kind of criticism of social media activism, where people say, oh, well, if you've tweeted or you've posted, then you haven't done anything more. But I think it's really important that we can see that hashtag data is backed up by protest data and then backed up again by legislative changes. So being able to kind of combat that narrative is really important, because we can see the power of social media connecting people around the world and achieving real change. So I have a few suggestions for future research. Firstly, I think it would be really great to create an academic use protest database. The protest database I used was kind of limited to 2020 onwards. The one that I found that captured Black Lives Matter from 2013 was not available for use at all, which made my life quite difficult, because it would have been brilliant to show kind of the movement as it's grown on the ground. So being able to create a database would be really important. Next, having real-time social media data. The organisation that I worked with, who tried to get social media data, found it really difficult to kind of get that historical data. We could really only go back 2 years, so again, 2020. So I would think that kind of capturing it in real time might make that a little bit easier, and we can kind of track that with protests and changes again. I think changes across the world would be really brilliant to explore as well. So in Australia, did we see any changes politically, or did it kind of fizzle out? That would be really interesting to explore. And also deaths in custody across the world. As I was kind of exploring different areas, I found that kind of the Black American experience was not unique, and that Black people all over the world are victims of state-sanctioned violence. And being able to track that is really important, because, again, a lot of countries are underreporting these numbers, and that doesn't capture the entire story or the severity of the situation. So in conclusion, Black Lives Matter is indeed a global social movement. It is not something that has been restricted to the US, but it has really grown through social media and through connection. I think it was really important to use multiple layers of data so that we can really get a comprehensive insight into Black Lives Matter and how it has organically grown across across space and time. And finally, storytelling is key to connection. The Black Lives Matter story is really powerful, and being able to tell that has been a privilege. This project would not have been possible without the Hive. It was a privilege to be able to use these facilities every week. I would like to thank Kylie. She's put in some incredible hours into this project, and she's incredibly dedicated, and very grateful for that. And also Andrew and Wesley for their weekly support as well. And then I would also like to thank Katharina Wolf and Bridget Tombleson. These two women really inspire me in public relations, and it's been really exciting to work with them in this project. And then that's my references, so yeah, thank you.
So Corey's project has been supported by the Fremantle Ports Community. Oh, what was that next word? Sorry?
Fund. Community fund?
Community fund, something like that, yeah. So Fremantle Ports have been very kind in supporting this particular project. And without saying much more, I'll just let you know the title: Fremantle Harbour Animated Panorama Project.
Hopefully it loads.
Woohoo! There we go.
Awesome. So, hello everyone. My name is Corey, and I am studying a Bachelor of Design, majoring in graphic design, digital design, and marketing. So my project over this summer has been the Fremantle Harbour Animated Panorama Project. Now, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Whadjuk people, the traditional custodians of the land in which this presentation is taking place on, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, for they hold the memories, culture, and hopes of Indigenous Australia. So the aim of my project was to create a wide-angle animated panoramic view of the Fremantle Harbour as viewed from the Fremantle Ports Administration building using a combination of historical and modern photography. The project was working with the Fremantle Ports to source eligible historical images and digitally distort, transform, merge, and stitch these images together to create a wide-angle panoramic composition, which could then be used for exhibition purposes by Fremantle. The process of image stitching involves combining two or more images together using a careful manual image stitching process, which I'll outline in this presentation. The project aims to present historical highlights of the Fremantle Harbour to further present the history of Fremantle Harbour from 1964 to current day. Panoramic photography is seen as a very visually dynamic way of telling a story. It can be a complex way to visualize a landscape and immerse the viewer into an immersive environment. And the intent of this project is that we create a wide-angle panorama that presents, visualize the history of the harbour and provide insight into moments of interest. So providing some background, the Historical Panoramas project has a website which was first launched in 2016. This project sourced photographs from the State Library of Western Australia and found images from 20 different locations around Perth and Fremantle and created them into a visually engaging website, which is available to view. In 2021, so just last year, another summer internship program undertook a analysis of the history of the Fremantle and proposed a historic panoramic display of the Fremantle Harbour, which has inspired this project. Now, for those that you don't know a lot about the history of Fremantle, the Fremantle Ports Administration building was opened in 1964, and from its view has seen an expansive amount of activity over the past 57 years. From there, there has been a wide range of ships that have come and visited port from that time, from naval visits, royal visits, cruise ships, and the like. So we will be finding historical photographs captured from a high vantage point and creating them in this presentation. So the objectives is to work with Fremantle Ports to find eligible historical images taken from the observation deck on level 8 of the Fremantle Ports Administration building, and then identify significant historical events of the Fremantle Harbour and image stitching these selected images into a panoramic video sequence. Creative techniques will be explored to essentially create a visual narrative on an evolving harbour landscape. And the project is expected to be used for the Fremantle Ports for exhibition uses. So, to give you an idea, I wanted to show you this image of the Royal Yacht Britannia in 1963 of Queen Elizabeth II and the Duke of Edinburgh. So this is the only image that has been found taken from a high vantage point. And so what we were trying to imagine is what the rest of the scene could look like, given that this is the only image. So using a little bit of magic, we've been able to stitch it and create something like this. Now here's another image taken of the USS Missouri in 1991, a very important naval visit at the time. And so using, identifying a combination of historical imagery and a little bit of magic again, we now would do a similar thing. Now that was the only image taken, and we've had to identify images taken around a similar time to create a composition like this. So how do we achieve this? So there's a 6-step process. So the first step is identifying those historical photographs taken from a high vantage point, determining a location which is most suitable for the creation of the panorama, finding where the most images have been taken from, then taking a modern-day panorama from that view, and then researching the history of the Fremantle Harbour and highlighting those significant events, and then digitally merging and stitching these together, and then using creative narrative to create an added sense of interest and impact. So the first step is identifying the historical photographs. During the length of the internship, I was given the privilege of looking through the photographic archive from the Fremantle Ports collection with permission from the Fremantle Ports archivist, Alan Pierce. So together we were able to identify around approximately 500 historical images taken from the observation deck. So some of these, and then through that we were able to identify around approximately 100 historical moments. So some of those historical moments may have had a lot of images taken and other might have been just a single moment. So we've kind of defined this as that most of the historical images taken were opportunistic and not really of a panoramic nature, because back then film photography was very expensive. So given these two examples, seen here of the blue menthol on the top and the Queen Frederica during the immigration period, those were the only images taken, and the rest of the scene has not been captured around the same time. So the next stage of the process is to determine a location with which most of these images are taken from. So from the observation deck, there are 3 viewpoints: the north corner, the west corner, and the tower. The west corner offers views of the entry to the port, such as the slipway, Forest Landing, A Shed, and North Mole Lighthouse. And the north corner looks out onto Victoria Quay, B Shed, C Shed, D Shed, the CBH silos before they were demolished, and the North Quay off in the distance. So using those 3 possible viewpoints identified, we have now have to determine the most suitable for the creation of this panorama. So using those 2 viewpoints, the west corner and the north corner, because the north corner is kind of in the middle and you can see both viewpoints from that higher angle. So what we've done in an initial test is overlaid those historical images onto the west corner panorama and the north corner panorama. And from that, we're able to identify 39 images taken from the west corner and 57 images taken from the north corner. So we can see that most of the photographers during the time were taking photos of that north corner. As you can see, it's far more expansive, and there's a greater opportunity for taking, capturing the activity of the port. So this test also showed a few challenges as well throughout the project. Given that there was no historical panoramas taken back then and film photography was quite expensive, you can see that there's two very particular areas where these photographs show up. And often there's a gap here and on the foreground, because from the observation deck, it's very hard to kind of lean over and get a view of the foreground. So using this test, we then had to create a modern day panorama. So traditionally, taking a panorama, if you're unaware, is capturing from a single viewpoint, standing with your camera on a fixed tripod and moving the camera and rotating around. Now, we've identified two viewpoints, which presents a very big challenge when we're wanting to incorporate images from the west corner and the north corner. So you can see here in these examples that when you capture a panorama from the west side and then also from the north corner, you can see that the perspective changes of B shed here. So if you can imagine yourself standing on the observation deck and physically moving from point A to point B, your perspective changes slightly and the scale of objects in the foreground also change. So in an experiment, I had to try and capture a panorama using both viewpoints. So by carefully moving across from point A to point B, the west corner to the north corner, we were able to create a new composition which looked like this. So it doesn't look like much, but you can see now we have a balanced view of the panorama of the harbour, and now we can incorporate photographs which have taken it from the west corner and also from the north corner. So the next stage is researching those historical moments. So with Alan Pierce, we were able to identify 31 historical moments from those original 500 images collected, following some certain project criteria to make sure that it's suitable for the project. So we need to make sure that they're observed from the observation deck, that they are of high quality and eligible to be reproduced on a large scale, such as the cylinder display, and that they're eligible for image stitching. Some examples below, you have the Queen visiting during her Jubilee tour in 1977, a Mexican tall ship in 2006, and an image titled A Busy Working Port, featuring the ship Kabali in 1966. So next stage is to digitally merge and stitch these images together. So for those that you are unaware, I've been working with Adobe Photoshop, which is a powerful software used for image stitching, graphic design, animation, digital art. And this has been the main software used to create these panoramas. So a variety of tools have been used because we've discovered that automatic image stitching is not really usable in this option because we're working with historical images that have been taken around a different time. So manual image stitching is required. So the tools used for manual image stitching are object selection, magnetic lasso tool, and the polygonal lasso tool. Those tools are helping with the selection of images. So when you put two images together, they can, and you select your features, you turn them into layer masks, which act as kind of like an eraser for the image, but preserving the original information. The two prints often were of different colors, so we used color correction and selective color tools to identify differences within color and creating a seamless transition between two prints. And the final step was to use the bicubic transformation tool and other transform distort tools to distort and manipulate the scale of certain objects, because as we know, not all images are taken from the exact point. Often some images might have taken a few meters away or further behind, so those tools are useful to match these two historical images together. So going back to our example that I showed at the start, here are two other images which have been identified that have been capturing alternative viewpoints of the harbour around a similar time. And you can see that the features kind of overlap. So we have the HMS Kent arriving in 1963 around the same time as the Royal Visit, and the Sea Search at Seashed here in 1965. So when these two images are overlapped, you can see that the features are crossing over each other, but as we've addressed before, this process is not very easy with automatic image stitching, the Photoshop tool that is used for automatic image stitching is called Photo Merge, and quite simply, these the software will not be able to detect that these images are compatible with each other. So I've come up with some manual image stitching principles to help identify if these images are suitable for image stitching. So we need to make sure that the images are taken from the same location, that they're taken of a high quality, as a lot of images may be preserved at a low res, or there might be image grain or noise distortion, that the features overlap each other, which we can see here. There is a crossover in the B shed, in the C shed up here, and we can kind of approximate that we can blend the background together as well. And a very important part of this process is making sure that there's a similarity in the time of day and weather. A lot of photographs may have been taken during sunset or sunrise, which creates very strong shadows that project onto, particularly here at C shed and D shed. So when you're combining two images taken at different times of the day, you have a change in the shadows and it looks very obvious. And then with weather particularly, sometimes there might be rain in the background that's captured, and then when you're transferring, or some kind of haziness. So when you're combining these two images, it creates some kind of issue, and you'll be able to see it. And the last thing is making sure that there's no minimal lens distortion. So using those principles, and we've been able to confirm them here, we get something that looks like this. A new panoramic sequence that is optimized for large-scale viewing. So the last step is to get creative. So the image is doesn't really tell a story without providing some more creative options explored. So we've been able to do look at a range of visual techniques, and visual narrative is basically the way of telling story through animation, photography, textures, for example, that can help create an added sense of impact and interest. So here is a sample from my project. As you can see, additional photographs have been included in the narrative, which have been texturized using Adobe stock textures that allude to their kind of historical importance and help reinforce the historical scene. The project title has been included at the top so that viewers that are coming and seeing the sequence know exactly what they're looking at. There's been titles and descriptions included to provide insight for those that don't know the history of the Fremantle harbour. There has been a slight animation added in some of those historical photographs, an animated timeline at the bottom, which has been created in Adobe After Effects, and that details the year that the event has taken, as well as some annotations, which you can see here, pointing out moments of interest captured in the photograph. So the outcomes, we've been able to identify 107 eligible historical panoramas or photographs that can be created into, that can be image stitched together and to create a new composition. In this project, we've been able to present 31 significant historical moments, as I wouldn't have had time to work on 107 throughout the length of this internship. The next step was successfully merging and digitally stitching these historical photographs, and creative approaches were explored to improve visual narrative. And now I showed this to the Fremantle Ports, and they seem pretty happy with the project, and they plan to use it for an upcoming exhibition. Their Maritime Day is coming up soon, and I'm hoping they use it for that. So future work. As I outlined before, additional historical photographs could be added. So I've just kind of included the ones that are of historical importance so that the audience can resonate and relate to them. There can be some optimization for website use. So this could be the rescaling of text and of photos to make it optimized for website use. And then we can also include other archival collections such as video, audio, and voiceover to enhance the storytelling. I would like to thank some people that have helped me throughout the length of this internship. Firstly, Associate Professor Andrew Woods. He has been amazing academic knowledge and historical knowledge and it's been a really great pleasure to work with. Alan Pierce, the Fremantle Ports archivist. He has an immense amount of knowledge on the history of the harbour, and I wouldn't have been able to do this project without him. Dr. Jolie Tay for creative advice and support throughout the project. Wesley Lamont for technical advice. It's been a pleasure to work with you too. And the Fremantle Ports Corporate and Community Relations for their support and for funding the project. Thank you.
Our first presenter in this block in session 2 this morning is Claudia Dixon. Again, I'm referring to my sheet here. It says here that Claudia is doing a Bachelor of Arts with a major in Screen Arts. Have I got that correct? Whoa, we're 2 out of 4. We're improving our hit rate. And this particular project is supported by the Western Australian Museum, so we appreciate and thank them for their support of this project. And Claudia's presentation title is Fremantle Historical Panorama Audiovisual Tours. I should have introduced myself. I'm Andrew Woods. I manage the Hive. I'm also one of the supervisors of this project. So actually, if you want to come up, Claudia, we'll get you mic'd up and then we'll get you started. All right.
Okay.
Over to you, Claudia.
Can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay, so like Andrew said, my name is Claudia and my project is the Historical Fremantle Panorama Audiovisual Tours. So I'll begin with some background on my project. Mine's actually based on a previous Hive summer internship project completed by Marcia Schneider, who created the Historical Panoramas website in 2016. So this website allows users to explore historical and modern day panoramas of Fremantle and Perth. As you can see here, these are 2 panoramas from the website. They're both taken from the tower of the Fremantle Town Hall. The first one in 1891, the second in 2017. And so to explore the panoramas on the website, the user would use a mouse or a touchscreen to zoom in, pan around to areas they want to look at, and click to fade to different years. So this is where my project comes in. So the website is an interactive experience that is really only suited to 1 or 2 people to use on a small screen, such as a tablet or a PC. And it doesn't really suit an audience of more than a few people to view on a larger screen, such as the Hive cylinder screen here. Because if one person was to control what a large group of people are seeing, it would become, the movements could be very fast and sporadic and cause some dizziness. So my objective was to create 3 audiovisual tours which adapt the panoramas from the website into these videos that are suitable for the cylinder screen and also an exhibition in the Maritime Museum about historical Fremantle. So these tours include a voiceover written by historians from the museum. So these voiceovers narrate what can be seen in the panoramas and give a background on the history of Fremantle. And then my job is to edit these together in the tours and edit the movements of the panoramas so they zoom in and pan around to the areas being discussed, as well as using visual effects to highlight what is being shown in the voiceover and what is being talked about. So to give an overview of my process for this project, after first obtaining the files from the website and choosing my editing program, I began to ideate and identify which effects were going to work best and what was going to be most effective in highlighting what was being discussed in the voiceover. And this took some testing, and I'll show you some examples of my tests in a moment. But after I found my chosen effects, I began to apply them to the first audiovisual tour. And then after that, it was really important to meet with WA Museum and show them my progress, as well as have the historian do a recorded reading of the voiceover so that I had an actual audio track that I could align my effects to and my movements. So I had an actual idea of timing. For example, when the effects should enter and exit, how long to hold them for, etc.
And then after that, it was of course important to actually export a version of it and test it on the Hive screen so that we could ensure that the movements were gradual and slow enough that no one was going to get dizzy, which was a challenge to also have it be in time with the voiceover and still be slow enough. So to go into like my actual process for editing, I chose to use After Effects to edit this project. Initially, I tried to use Premiere Pro, which is another video editing software, but I found that it wasn't as capable as After Effects for dealing with Panorama's large file sizes. And Premiere is also much more suited to video editing, whereas After Effects has all the tools and functions that I was looking for to edit my visual effects. So here are some examples here of some of my tests. The first one on the left is a magnifying glass style effect, which what it did was zoom into a small area that was being discussed in the voiceover, and it created an animated circle that came out and had an enlarged area. I ended up deciding that this was a bit too visually convoluted, and it was actually better to just zoom all the way in and have that area fill the entire screen. The second test here is, you can see some red circles, which were an animated circle that drew around the area being discussed. And this was actually a suggestion from someone at the museum, but I ended up choosing a different effect, which I found was much simpler and more effective, which I'll show you in a second. Pretty much the objective of these effects is to capture the audience's attention so their eye is drawn to the correct place at the correct time. But at the same time, you don't want to overpower the panoramas because they are the focus of the audiovisual tours. So here are two of the effects that I ended up using. These are the ones that I utilized the most. The first is, up the top there, is the replacement to the red circles, which is pretty much an animated yellow line that outlines what is being highlighted. So I don't know if you can tell here, but they're outlining all the chimneys on the houses. And then the second one, in the two images down the bottom here, it's kind of a yellow tinted highlight effect, which I achieved by using the mask tool and applying a brightness and tint to that mask, also feathering it a lot so that it had a blurred edge. And these two effects I interchanged using based on the situation. So the outline effect was much more suited to an object that had a hard edge, such as a building or part of a building, like the chimneys here, whereas the highlight was much more suited to areas that didn't have that distinct, defined border. For example, on the right here, you can see that it's highlighting the rock bar that's at the mouth of the river, and on the left it's highlighting some horses and chickens. And then, yeah, here's some more examples of the effect, using to highlight the road there. And I ended up using lines to highlight these roads down here because they were like smaller roads that were obstructed from view by the buildings, so the lines indicate where they are. Yeah, and then of course the second most important part of editing the audiovisual tours is editing the movement. And I did this using keyframes in After Effects, which is, if you don't know what a keyframe is, it's pretty much the way that you can create a slow, gradual transition for your effects and animations. So pretty much the further apart the keyframes are, the slower the zoom in will be, if that makes sense. And yeah, these two effects work well because they are minimal, but they at the same time don't overpower the panoramas. And the yellow also contrasts and stands out well against the black and white. So I'll go into a bit about what each tour is actually about. So the script for the first tour was written by Stephen Anstey, who's a historian from the WA Museum. And he chose to base this sequence around the two panoramas that I showed earlier from the view of the tower of the Fremantle Town Hall. First one in 1891, second one in 2017. And so he kind of broke it down into three sections. The first one about housing and the way the houses were built in 1891 Fremantle. As you can see in the second image, the roofs are being highlighted as he discusses the types of materials that we use to build roofs. Secondly, he chose to discuss the lack of sanitisation and bad health and hygiene in 1891 Fremantle, as seen in this backyard here off Market Street, where you can see a man is resting here next to horses and chickens and outdoor toilets and also water wells that are nearby. And lastly, he chose to discuss family life and also the domestic work that was done by a lot of the women, seen here in this backyard, where you can see I've highlighted the washing as it's being discussed. And so the scripts for the second and third tours were done by the historian Mike Lefroy, and he chose to discuss convicts for his first one. And so this explores early convict arrival to Fremantle, as well as some of the buildings that were built by the convicts. And this sequence utilises 4 panoramas, all taken from the old Arthur Head Lighthouse in 1879, 1890, 1902 and 2016. And being able to have all 4 of these panoramas allows the audience to get a really good idea of how Fremantle changed in its early years of colonisation. For example, you can see here in these 2 images, in 1819 and 1902, the commissariat stores is highlighted, which is now the WA Shipwrecks Museum. And you can see how the land gets built up around the building, as well as the addition of the South Jetty, the small jetty, which was part of the early port, which leads into the third audiovisual tour, also written by Mike Lefroy, which discusses early port activity in Fremantle, including gauge roads, the river and sea jetties, as well as O'Connor's plan to put a harbour in the river mouth. And this tour also uses the 2 panoramas from the Town Hall, 1891 and 2017, as well as this one here from the old Harbour Trust building in 1896. So the 2 Town Hall panoramas allow you to see a really broad view of the coast of Fremantle, whereas this one gives you a much closer look into the work that O'Connor actually had done to the harbour, including these trestles that he had here, which he was using to blow up the rock bar up here to allow ships to actually enter the river mouth. Because before that, they would have to dock here at this sea jetty, be unloaded, transported along Cliff Street here to this river jetty, where they could then be transported up the river to Perth. So I'll talk a bit about future work for this project. So the voiceovers that are accompanying the tours are actually only a temporary audio track, because the scripts that the museum provided haven't been finalised, and so before a new high quality voiceover can be recorded, they will need to be edited and approved by all the appropriate people. There are also only 3 sequences that I was able to create during the time of this internship, so more could be added for the exhibition, which will be in October. I actually started working on one using this watercolour panorama done by Jane Eliza Curry in 1832. And this could be used in a tour alongside a modern day panorama that could be taken from the same location. And the challenge there would be estimating where this was actually painted from, because as you can see, the landscape has changed dramatically since 1832. I would just like to thank my supervisor, Andrew, and my Hive support supervisor, Wes, as well as Stephen Anstey and Mike Lefroy from the WA Museum for their work on the scripts, and everyone else from the WA Museum who helped me with my project, Donna, Matthew, Renee, and Tanya. Thanks, and that's my reference.
So our next presentation is Harry Booker. Harry is studying mechatronics and computer science. He's in his 4th year. Have I got that right?
Yes.
Hey, 3 out of 5. Good. And his topic is using non-invasive sensors to classify the quantity and quality of spontaneous movement undertaken by adults in a hospital bed when acutely unwell.
Yeah.
I've got a slightly longer version that's on screen here.
I've shown the touch.
Yeah. So the supervisors for this project are Kylie Hill from the Curtin School of Allied Health, Savash Kashkar from the School of Electrical Engineering, Computing and Mathematical Sciences, and also Chelly Tan, and has been supported by Wesley Lamont from the Hive. So over to you, Harry.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so in this presentation, I'll just go over what my project was, why it's important, what I did, and what I ended up with. So I'll give just a brief background on the project. And so to begin with, I'll introduce the Hive, and that's different from this curtain Hive. It's the East Metropolitan Health Services Hive. It's health in a virtual environment. And it's a remote monitoring system that's at Royal Perth Hospital and Armidale Hospital. And it just acts as a second pair of eyes for the ward staff that are taking care of the patients in the hospital. So there's a team of senior doctors and nurses that are in a centralized location within Royal Perth Hospital. And they just have access to, as you can see in the image, like live patient monitoring data, medical imaging, all that kind of stuff, so that they can monitor the patient, monitor their condition, and if anything goes wrong, they can get in contact with the ward staff and help them out and assist them. And currently, they don't have access to any data that in relation to the movements of the patient or what the patient's doing. They can call in to view the patient, but obviously that can't be done all the time, and then there's privacy concerns with the patients being recorded. So, and it's hypothesized that the integration of movement data, along with their current monitoring and physiological data, will improve the function of the Hive and also improve the health and recovery of the patients. And that can happen as sort of like a canary in a coal mine, sort of demonstrating like if something's going wrong with the patient, like if their heart rate is increased and they're moving a lot, then maybe that's fine because it's because of their movement. But if their heart rate's increased and they haven't been moving, then it might be an issue. And also, it could help with the rehabilitation and further research into rehabilitation and recovery of the patients, because there's a lot of sedentary behavior when patients are recovering from different illnesses and surgery and that kind of stuff. So the main objective of this project was to map the data captured from inertial measurement unit sensors to a 3D human body model of a person in a hospital bed. And the inertial measurement unit sensors, they've got a combination of an accelerometer, a gyroscope, and a magnometer. And the ones that we used for this project, I've got one right here. They're made by a company called XSense, and they make these motion capture sensors for films and for game development. And these ones in particular, they're Bluetooth sensors, and they're used for motion capture in sport and also health. And yeah, they're highly accurate sensors because they fuse the data collected, so they measure linear and angular acceleration along with the magnetic field, and they can combine all that data together using a specialized algorithm that's been tailored for human movements, and that just can produce a very accurate, in this case using orientation data, so just it can be used to find the angles of the joints and how they move over time. And here's an example of just applying one of the sensors and what they look like on the body. And they can also be put on in different ways, like using straps and Velcro. So visualizing movements using IMU sensors, what does that look like? So here I've got an example of me lying down in a bed, and I've got a few sensors on me. You can see one on my arm there and on my head and my leg. And then that's translated into a visual representation of a 3D model. And it's, as you can see, like none of the features of the model are identifiable as being me. It's purely just the movements, or in this case, the position. And then privacy is extremely important because patients in hospital are in a vulnerable state. So using these sensors, they're measuring purely just the inertial measurements. So the angles and the motion, and they're not, so this means that we don't have to record using cameras or anything like that. And let's go over method and what I did. So selecting the software, I use Unity, which is a game engine. And although this isn't a game, it's using user input and input from that's being streamed in from the data, from the sensors, and that's manipulating the 3D models within the program. So that's why Unity is very helpful, and it just provides a lot of tools that you can use to develop the software. And then there's connecting to the sensors. So there are Bluetooth sensors, and I've used a Bluetooth connection module created by Adil, and he's a previous honors student, and he wrote that for his honors project. And then I did some initial testing, just starting off with mapping the rotations of the sensor so that it matches the on the screen representation, because Unity and the sensors, they use a different coordinate system. So initially, I just had to make sure that the mapping was accurate, and then I created the scene. And in the scene, I just wanted I wanted it to provide like the visual context of a hospital setting, but not to have too much going on, and for it to not be distracting to the user, so that you could focus on the movements of the person. And then starting off small with the 2 sensors on the arm, and then expanding that to the full body. So I've got a recording here of me moving around. And in this recording, I've got 7 sensors on me. So I've got 1 on my head, 2 on each arm, and 2 on my legs. And that's just a demonstration to show the full movement, but it's not necessarily applicable to all cases. Like, not all people would require 7 sensors. There might be some cases where you just need 1, or it would depend on the different cases. And then creating a user interface to adjust different settings, such as assigning sensors to different parts of the body, changing the view so you can look around the bed from different positions, and that kind of stuff. And then data presentation and secure recording of the data. So it's like experimenting with different ways of representing the joint angles, and also securely saving them to a research drive. And this example, this is just me moving my head around quite quickly. It's just saved to a CSV file, and then I've just gone into Excel and plotted it out. And this example on the left, there's some movement, like range of movement sliders. So you can see the X, Y, and Z axes. And then when you move the joint, the slider will move with the angle, and then you can set the range of motion limits. And then if it goes past those limits, like it'll light up saying the limits have been exceeded. And then also event-based alerts based on the quality and quantity of movement, such as the quality of the position that they're in or the level of activity. So if the person in the bed hasn't been moving, then it can set off an alert saying this person needs to be moved. Because if people are in the same position for too long, they can develop bed sores and have poor circulation and that kind of stuff. And then I'll give some examples. So you can see on the right, that's an example of the person not moving in a long time, and that time can be set to different times. And then also on the left, that's an example of improper position, I guess. So if a person's been put on their side, and they haven't been put on their side correctly, where their hips are still flat, but they've rotated their upper body, then that can cause some issues, and that can occur. So that's just an example. So in that case, you can have one sensor on your upper body and then one on your lower body. And if you're on your side and they're out of line, then you can determine and just present a warning and say this might be an issue. And that issue can be checked. And then I've got some recordings of some further results. So this is an example of minimizing number of sensors. So just having just one on the upper body to determine the movements, like the frequency of movements and the position changes. And then you can add on further sensors to view the movements of other parts of the body. So I've just added one onto my head, just as a demonstration. And then this is an example of the range of movements. So I've got one on my head, and then I'm moving them in all the axes of movement. And you can see there we go. So if it exceeds the range, then it'll light up, and the corresponding axes will light up. And then you can adjust those bounds. So you can imagine if somebody's had some kind of injury where they can't move around too much, you could do something like this, where you just bring in the limits, and then if they move, then it'll light up red. There we go. Cool. And there's lots of future work that could be done with this project, but just one of them I'll briefly mention is to resolve some of the Bluetooth limitations that I faced. And that may either be through reworking some of the aspects of the Bluetooth module, because it wasn't really written for this purpose. It was created for fewer sensors. But also there's just a limitation in the Bluetooth communication protocol that means that you can only connect to 7 devices. So if more than 7 is required, then they could look into using a different communication protocol. And then I'd like to acknowledge my supervisors, Associate Professor Kylie Hill, Siavash Kakshar, Professor Telly Tan and Wesley Lamont, and also all the help that I've gotten from all these other wonderful people. Carly, Adele Yatin, Joshua, Dr. Meg Harold, Eliza Stewart, and Alex Ferres. Thank you very much.
All right, so our next presenter is Samia Jabor, who is a PhD candidate in the School of Media, Creative Arts and Social Inquiry here at Curtin in the Faculty of Humanities. Samia is being supervised by John Curtin Distinguished Professor Kim Scott, who's in the audience. Here he is. Samia's presentation is Mapping Willoman, and I'll let you pronounce the next bit.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks everyone for being here. And shout out to all the millions on YouTube as well. Oh, I can, great. Thank you. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're on Whadjuk Noongar country and pay my respects to Noongar elders past, present and future. And I extend that acknowledgement to all Noongar participants in the room here today, not least of all Professor Kim Scott, Mandy Downing. And I'd also like to acknowledge that the work that we're going to see some of today has been produced on and for the Williman Noongar community. So I acknowledge this community on the south coast of WA also. So by way of introduction, I haven't started mine, sorry. So by way of introduction, my name is Samia Jabor. I'm a PhD candidate, as Andrew said, in the Curtin School of Makazi and DBE, so that's Cultural Studies and Geography. So I have a professional background in environmental management and spatial science and reporting, but a series of life-changing events a few years ago led me to pursue a PhD in decolonising environmental custodianship. I transferred my PhD to Curtin in 2021, and late last year I was invited by Professor Kim Scott and the William and Noongar community to produce a digital mapping platform to support their cultural heritage. So I'm a non-Indigenous woman here on Noongar Budja, and I'm also a first-generation Australian displaced from and unable to live on my ancestral country due to settler colonialism elsewhere. So I take seriously my responsibility in this place and my commitment to decolonial practice on this country. Professor Kim Scott, of course, needs no introduction. He's a highly acclaimed writer, poet and novelist, and twice recipient of the Miles Franklin Award. But also, and perhaps more importantly, Kim Scott is a respected elder in the William and Noongar community and is answerable to the senior elders and community on the South Coast. So those watching in person here today will be treated with a live demonstration afterwards, which won't be recorded, which Kim will direct us through. So the project Mapping Wirlaman Dwart Balkat is the first few weeks of really a multi-year collaboration with William and Noongar Language and Stories project. And the story of Dwart Balkat originated somewhere between 60,000 years ago and the beginning of time. It's a creation story etched into the landscape and the psyche of the William and Noongar ancestral country and community. But this is also the story of its reclamation from the ashes of a brutal colonial history on WA's south coast and the remarkable healing power of community. Mapping Wirlaman is the result of at least 20 years of research and community development work by William and Noongar Language and Stories, and more than 200 years of safeguarding from settler colonial repression before that. And this is the first time in its history that this creation story has been put on the map in digital form. So I haven't felt any pressure at all. But given all you've just heard, I'm hoping that you can cut us some slack by remembering that what you're about to see is really just the result of the first 10 weeks of, this iteration. So this internship project has been a really wonderful first step into how we digitise this archive. So along with the legacy of the William and Noongar Language and Stories, this project really sits within an emerging discipline of Indigenous and decolonial digital mapping. So Indigenous data sovereignty is a new term for an old concept, really, but it's defined here as the rights of Indigenous people to exercise ownership over Indigenous data. Ownership of data can be expressed through the creation, collection, access, analysis, interpretation, management, dissemination, and reuse of Indigenous data. So the Wirlaman elders are particularly concerned to consolidate their heritage in its home community. So protecting the digital privacy, protecting data sovereignty for the Wirlaman community and data privacy were really at the top of my list of priorities when I was doing this project. The early stages of this project really involved a lot of me and Kim talking through what was possible, what the archive looked like, what the mapping software was capable of, what was needed to merge the two together. And that process took about 4 weeks, I would say, of us kind of getting a handle on what was possible, what we had, what we needed to present. So Kim had the unenviable job of working through a really massive archive that's been collected over many, many years. And I was working on building a spatial database in GIS, or QGIS. I deliberately use QGIS because it is a open source free software which is almost identical to the ArcGIS, which is used in universities. But so basically I'm trying to make it accessible for the community to use down the track. So it was, as I mentioned, really important to make sure that Williman data privacy was protected, and how could we make sure that that was done? And it wasn't until 4 weeks in that I realised what I was trying to do was actually 4 different projects, and this Hive project was one of them, and that is to how do we digitally represent this kind of spatial data for an audience. Not that that's going to be a public audience. At the moment, that's a very private audience just for the Williman community. But in the future, what kind of technology is possible to allow that? So I've stopped the methods here because I hit a really important stumbling block, which was Mapbox was presented as a mapping platform. And those of you who had the privilege of seeing Grace's demonstration earlier will see what Mapbox is capable of. It's a really fantastic program for digitising maps and telling stories through the map. But given the data sovereignty issues that I needed to contend with, I read the licensing agreements and I came across this ownership clause. And the first one says that you retain the ownership of all the content. It's called your content. But the second point says, but you hereby grant Mapbox a non-exclusive, worldwide, royalty-free, fully paid up, transferable and sub-licensable right and license to use, cache, copy, publish, display, distribute, modify, create derivative works and store your content, etc. So this was a major stumbling block. I realised I can't use this program as it is designed. So I did some research and I got in touch with an Indigenous mapping organisation called Terra Stories. They actually work with, they've set up Indigenous mapping platforms for use with Indigenous groups in the Amazon rainforest. And I asked how, because they use Mapbox in their, for their mapping platforms. So I asked how they get around that clause, given that data privacy is really important to them as well. And they actually hadn't heard about that clause. So we've since been, we had a really interesting conversation over from here to the Amazon to look at how they got around this. And through that collaboration, I actually understood how it was possible to use Mapbox offline. And so it is possible to pull the functionality of Mapbox down. There's 2 things that happen. One is that the fancy mapping software gets pulled down, and the other thing that can happen is you load data up onto the map. So I didn't load any data, any sensitive data onto the map. I was only using it to download mapping data down from the map. It may not make sense just yet. But I realised that it was actually possible to work offline and to work safely with this mapping platform, which is what I then did. So from there, around 4 weeks in, I started to look at Mapbox. So bear in mind, I had to look at how to use this program safely before I'd ever used this software before. So it was quite a stressful process to look at, well, how do I keep this data safe when I've never used this program before. So that took some time. But once we started to realise what was possible with Mapbox, we then started to refine the story. And then Kim started to draft a script, and between us we started to refine the scope, and we continued to build these chapters in Mapbox, working offline. So some of the outcomes that you'll see in the live demonstration, there's basically 3 stages to the demonstration. The first is just an opening scene. So the one on the left here shows a bit of a taste of what's to come. But then the first half of the presentation, the map looks like a conventional map. So the map goes flat, north is at the top, and it's an aerial view. So this is what we'd call a conventional, a mapping convention. And I realised actually that Mapbox was one of the few softwares that I know that can actually move that north convention on a map. So it's got some really powerful characteristics. But I deliberately tried to make the first part of the story quite flat and quite with north at the top and with English language. And then as we move in, you'll see the story change quite dramatically. And as we move into the story, the map begins to come alive. We haven't quite got there yet, but this is what we were aiming for, was to bring that landscape alive, to move into 3D terrain modelling, and to use mostly Noongar language instead of English. So some of the advantages of this approach are that it's been a really powerful way to use a map to tell a story. Mapbox has some really impressive functionality, which, to be honest, I'm really only touching the surface of. I would love to have the opportunity to explore this a lot more. It's relatively easy to operate. It's designed for use by journalists and, not coders, basically. So people who, like me, have not done coding before, it's relatively simple to use. And I used it mainly offline. And when I say mainly, I mean that the only thing I'm needing to be online for is to drag those maps down. So I'm not loading anything up to it. And this is what the code looks like. So one of the shortcomings of this approach, and Grace touched on this earlier as well, is that because I wasn't putting any, I wasn't drawing any boundaries, if you like, or anything onto the map, as I mentioned, I was using the extent of the screen to roughly show the geographic area of the areas that I was interested in. But as Grace also mentioned, that completely falls over when you put it on a different screen, because the screen aspect changes the whole geographic display. I tried it on this screen, which is very, very long, and this area ended up all the way to New Zealand and way out in the Indian Ocean. So that, that was a big wake-up call that actually, this is very specific at the moment to the screen that it's being played on, but I think there's a way to hack that in future. So the difficult parts were definitely the coding errors. As a very new person to coding, this was a big learning curve. So any comma, any bracket, any, God forbid, apostrophe in the wrong place will just crash the whole system and turn it white, and there's absolutely no clue about where the problem is. So trying to find the problem is literally like looking for a needle in a multi-thousand line code of haystack of code, whatever that is. the other problem I encountered was that so some of the map functionality was incredibly easy and some was really surprisingly difficult. So because of the way that I had chosen to use it, I was using imagery overlaid on top of a bare map, and that allowed me to protect the data from going onto the map. But you'll see in the demonstration there are a number of times in there where I've aligned the background map with the foreground image. But to do that was surprisingly difficult actually, because it's the map, the image is in a fixed position, so I had to move the map under it. But if you can, I know there are a few geographers in the room who might appreciate this, but to do that I had to think about, okay, so there's the map needs to move a little bit to the right. So therefore, the center point of the map needs to move a little bit to the left. And therefore, the easting needs to get a little bit smaller. And by how many, roughly, decimal degrees? Like this was all kind of quite mirrored calculations I was trying to do. But generally speaking, the mapping was quite lovely. As in the process of doing it was quite straightforward. So the best parts have certainly been the collaboration with Kim Scott. I feel extremely privileged to have had such a close collaboration and sharing of such an extraordinary archive. It's been an extraordinary privilege to have been trusted by the Williman community to hold this data and to be able to just start to touch how precious it is to be able to tell such an important story through in a digital way, in a very new way. So obviously this is just the start of what's possible, and yeah, I can't imagine I could ever do it justice in 6 weeks or 10 weeks, but yeah, I think there's a lot of potential for this to inform how we go ahead in future. So thank you. Thank you to Kim Scott. Thank you to the Williman community. Thank you to the Hive, to my mentors, Wesley and Carly and Andrew, and all of you looking here today. Thank you so much.
Welcome everyone. Back here for the third session of the Hive Summer Internship Showcase. So we've had 6 presentations this morning. We've got a total of 9 students who've been beavering away over the summer on their 10-week projects. We very much appreciate all of their hard work and also the great supervision that they've been receiving from both their academic supervisors and also the Hive team who provide the visualisation expertise. Many of the internships this year have been supported by external organisations, and we appreciate their support. One of the ones this afternoon has been supported by the I thought it was Australasian Diving Safety Foundation. Yeah, I think so. It's written Australian here, so a bit of transcription error. I think there might have been me. So we appreciate the involvement of external organisations in supporting these internships as well. Welcome back to session 3. Our first presentation will be by Mari Conradi, who's my recollection is mechatronics and computer science degree student, and her project's being supervised by Eleanor Sandry and Gwyneth Peaty, who are both in the audience here. So thank you. They're from the School of Media, Creative Arts and Social Inquiry here in the Faculty of Humanities. And her project is titled VR Communicative Robots. So Over to you, Mari.
Cool. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for being here. As Wesley just said, I am the intern on the project titled Communicative Drones in VR. I need to click on. So technology, machines, and robots, they're clearly everywhere around us, and we experience them most days. And we communicate with them. I mean, right now, my clicker is communicating with a computer, which is going to communicate with a screen. And I'm sure many of you, let's get a raise of hands, how many of you have said the phrase, "Okay, Google," at least once in your life? Me too. I have both a Google Nest and a Google Hub inside my house. So "Okay, Google" is a very common phrase in my house. And even last night, when I was practicing this speech, they both responded to me asking that specific question. But maybe you prefer your robots to be more useful, to do something for you. Like my little minion there in the middle, my EcoVac robot, which cleans for me even when I'm not home. And it talks to me. You know, when it gets stuck, it says, "Okay, driver wheel issue, please help." Or "Can't find home, please guide back to home." But they might seem intelligent. But these robots are not the type of intelligence we are considering or communication considering when it comes to drones. So the main aims of my project was to create a VR model of a drone which we can interact with inside of this reality. And we wanted to make it teleoperated so that a person could be this drone and could control it in a very intellectual way as which a drone would be. And then finally, we wanted it to be networked so that a person could experience the drone with this human level interaction. So most of the time when I've been talking about drones, let me set the scene for you first, sorry. So the scene is the Culture series by Ian M. Banks, and it is set in a science fiction interstellar world where there is aliens and humanoids and very smart AI ranging from below human level to hyper-intelligent minds, which are very interesting. But most of the time when I've been talking about drones, you've probably been thinking these type of drones. But these are not the drones we are looking for. The drones we are looking for are much more interesting. They have their own personality, and these creatures are so intellectual in a similar way to how humans are, in the fact that they have emotions. These droids use force fields to float instead of having limbs or wheels, and they're made up of robotic and organic parts. These drones also range very much in size and design, as you can see by the fan art I have on the screen here. They range from being small enough to fit in the palm of your hand to being 1 meter across. But the main thing that this project focuses on is their form of communication and the fact that they use a color-changing aura to communicate these emotions. So as you can see in the middle, humans already connect emotions to colors. We already have a set spectrum which we take as being normal. And the drone challenges this spectrum. And that'll be very interesting to see how humans find these differences. You might be wondering, why do I have little monsters on the far side of my screen? And they are actually the newest addition to the Microsoft Teams Reflect. And they are aimed to increase the emotional vocabulary of students. And I found them very fascinating for this project in the way that they also have one base color for one specific class of emotion. So like if you were happy or excited, you might be the little blue one, or if you were scared, you'd be the little red one. And then finally, the Insight Heart on this side of the screen is a program that is set up very similarly to how I wanted to set up the drone, because it allows a teacher and a student to interact with this networked product. And it was already set up into an augmented and virtual reality world. And so I was basically going to do that, just with a drone instead of a heart. So how did I get to this point? The process started with learning the programs. As said before, I'm an engineering student, so I did not have much background in working with Unity or Blender for that case, and I'd only tattled with it a little bit. So I learned the programs after many, many YouTube videos and completing many, many tutorials. Then I had to create my basic model. And as you'll see in the next slide, it was very basic. It was a sphere that I'd made a little bit spiky and put a donut shape as the eyes. Then I was lucky enough to get a network framework from Wesley. Even though I had tried to do the networking myself, I could not get the networking to work. So I was lucky enough to use that, and then I could just drop my model in, and that was very helpful. Then it came to creating the VFX graph for my aura. So as you can see on the far side, my first draft of the drone was very basic. It was a sphere that had a bigger outer sphere, which was the emotion. And I was going to use that and just change the shape a little bit and keep it translucent, but I was not happy with the way that this was looking. And so I ended up going for a different approach and using the VFX graph to create this aura you see on the side. And I was drawn to it mainly because it was a lot more descriptive. And I could use it a lot more in different ways. Like I could change the turbulence of the side and the way that the particles move to allow it to seem more calm or to seem more upset. I could also change the color and the brightness and the way that it glowed. Cool. Then I went into making my animations. And so my animations were very basic, and I simply just dragged and dropped the drone using the animated view on how I wanted it to appear and how I wanted it to bounce when it was happy, or to shake its head when it was unhappy, or to twist and turn when it was displeased. So that was fun. And then I gained some informal feedback by sending this video to a bunch of my friends and getting them to just attach one thing to the other side. So what color matched what emotion? And this feedback was very useful, as it actually led to me changing a few of my animations. I swapped the white and the pink, as the pink was described as being a lot more angry almost. Yes, the pink was a lot more angry while the white was seen as being more busy. And so I just swapped those two to allow them to be more accurate to how people receive them. And this was a color change that still fit within the color descriptions found inside the book. Cool. And then I had to finish off my network syncing. So at this point, the drone was inside the virtual reality, and two characters could be inside of this virtual reality. But if I pressed a button to change the drone, to make it blue instead of pink, then the other player didn't see that. And so that was a big issue, because that defeated the whole point of it being networked. The whole purpose was so that those color changes would be displayed across the screen. And so I ended up making a simple remote procedural call file, like a script, that just called the animations for any other networked players. So if one person pressed the button, then the button got pressed for everyone. And then for final graphics, I added a background which we actually decided to be the Hive, to make it a familiar environment with this unfamiliar drone within it. And then we also made an invisible avatar. So for the purpose why we did that is because we wanted the drone to be the drone, and the person controlling the drone had to almost seem like it was the drone. And so by having it invisible, the player sees this drone and hears this drone, but she doesn't see the person. And so we found that would be a vital part to it for if you're trying to experience something that's non-humanoid. So here's my results. Oh, it's going to play. There you go. So as you can see on the sides, we've got all the different emotions that we've implemented, and the surprise and the color. So that was good. And this also actually demonstrates the fact that the teleoperations and the networking is working, as I was simply looking at the drone recording this video while my sister was pressing all the buttons and operating it. So that was very cool to see it working. But one thing that we didn't get to was actually the audio. So in research considering robots and virtual reality and human interaction with them, it's often been said that audio is the key aspect of that. And so there is verbal communication, like I can speak through it, but I haven't edited it, so I don't have any voice distortion at this point. But it would be very useful to add a voice distortion so that the droid's voice isn't humanoid. It isn't humanistic in any sort of way, and there's no like tone description, so that the color aura is the only way of knowing the actual emotion that this droid is trying to depict. Furthermore, I think it'd be very useful to create more than one drone. so that a person can see these drones interacting with each other in this virtual reality. And then it'd be interesting to see if a person sees them as they would animals interacting with each other, or if they see them as also the same level of intelligence, as because they are. Like, these drones are the same level of intelligence as we are. Thank you very much for listening. I would like to thank my supervisors, Dr. Eleanor Strandy and Gwyneth Peaty, for all their support and their knowledge around the books and the drones throughout this process. And I wanted to thank Carly Tilbert and Wesley Lamont for their technical support throughout all my issues. Thank you very much.
Next presentation is by Rupert Cotter. Rupert is also a mechatronics student in the Faculty of Science and Engineering. And this project is also sort of a crossover between different fields, both science and engineering and the health sciences. It's been supervised by Tamiya Rice, I hope I got that right, Ian Murray and Darren Beals. Tamiya and Ian are from the School of Electrical Engineering, Computing and Mathematical Sciences, and Darren is from the School of Allied Health. And this presentation is titled Visualization, unless of course the title's changed recently. No, it hasn't. Visualization of human brain function captured with near-infrared spectroscopy. I finally got it right. Over to you, Rupert.
Sensational, thank you. Alrighty. Yeah, as Andrew said, my name is Rupert Cotter, and this summer I've been in the Hive working on this project, visualization of human brain function captured with near-infrared spectroscopy. And as Andrew said, this was supervised by primarily by Dr. Hania Baksheyesh, and from within the Hive here by Carly Tilbert, up the back. Yeah. So, quick little disclaimer before we get started on this. I'm an engineering student, and I'm in no way a health science student. So, if you do notice anything a little bit questionable throughout this, please call me out on it, but just wait till after the presentation. Easy. So, to get started, I think we should run down, do a little breakdown of what's coming up. So, first of all, I want to take a look at why we're actually doing this project. What's the point? Then we're going to have a look at what actually is near-infrared spectroscopy. And then following that, we'll have a look at how the problem is solved. And then why this might be interesting into the future. So, right. First things first, I think it's good to break down this title, because it is a little bit of a mouthful, and have a look at what we're actually trying to do. We want to reconstruct images detailing human brain function and how it changes across the brain. That's what we're trying to do, and currently this task can be done. There's a few methods of doing that already. You might be familiar with things like fMRI or CT scan. And if you're familiar with those, I'm sure you're probably familiar with potentially how complicated they are, not to mention expensive, or even that they might come along with some drawbacks, whether that's powerful magnets in the case of MRI, or the large radiation dose that goes along with a CT scan. Now, near-infrared spectroscopy, this is our device here. The devices are much smaller, more portable, and use much simpler technology, not to mention stylish on the forehead as well. But one thing I want to illustrate is how simple the technology that these use. So these are two examples of near-infrared devices. This is the one we've got, potentially for people online, and this is just a different model. How they actually work and what they actually are is something we probably need to talk about. So what is NIRS? I think it's best that we probably start breaking down the name first. Let's start by looking at spectroscopy, and then we'll look at light afterwards. So put incredibly simply, we can just say spectroscopy is an investigation of light's interaction with matter. But in our case, the light we're dealing with is near-infrared light. So what is near-infrared light? Something we come in contact with all the time, but on the surface it could sound complicated, like could be like strong magnets or radiation, but it really is something super simple. And to illustrate that, I have this. This is just an ordinary TV remote, and what these use to communicate with TVs around us is a little near-infrared LED in the front. Now I can press a button, and you shouldn't be able to see that anything's going on. But if I show you this video here, you can in fact see that the light does light up. Now that's the same thing as the LEDs on our headband. So there's 8 LEDs, and you can see when we start a recording, the lights light up. That's not something we can see with our eyes, but my phone does manage to capture near-infrared light. And the point of this is to illustrate that some of the technology that these use really is such a commonplace, ordinary thing. And we use it every day to do something as trivial as change the TV station. That being said, how does it work? How does it use this light to capture brain function? Essentially what it does is it uses the fact that the body is incredibly transparent, or reasonably transparent to the specific wavelengths of light that this device uses. And I say wavelengths here because it does use two. Each one of these being tuned to be absorbed by either oxygenated or deoxygenated hemoglobin. So that allows us to track the changes of oxygenation within the blood, which of course changes as a result of mental workload. So we can actually take a look into brain activity through the lens of oxygen concentration using one of these devices. Cool. So what is the problem that we wanted to solve? We essentially wanted to reconstruct images of how how brain activity changes across the brain. And there's a little bit of a process that I use to go about doing that. We can break it down into roughly these 4 steps. The first of which, we had to develop a test that we could then go and gather some meaningful data with. And we can then take that data through a processing stage, which we can break up into 2 steps itself. The first being some pre-processing, and the second, what we're after, visualization. Rightio. So, taking a look at the first one of these, the main constraining factor for which test we had to pick simply comes down to where the device sits. And it sits on the forehead, so just above the prefrontal cortex. So to pick a test, we essentially had to decide on a test that would evoke a response from the prefrontal cortex, which is good. It's a nice thing to be constrained by. So what we ended up landing on was, don't mind me, I've forgotten to take a little note for myself out. Yeah. So what we end up landing on is an NBAC test. An NBAC test is a working memory test. Essentially what you have to do is, what the participants had to do was be presented with a letter on screen at a time, and you had to verify whether that letter was or wasn't a match with the previous letter. And in the case of the test we're going to look through, you have to compare it to the letter that came just before it. To get a better understanding of this though, I think it's good we do a little practice run together. So I'm actually going to get all of you involved. You're going to have to call out yes for a match and no for not a match. We'll go through and we'll do 4 letters as a test first, and then you're going to have a shot at the proper test in a second. So that's our first letter. We want to compare the next letter against this. So let me hear you. Music. Brilliant. And again? Go. Hey, what do you know? It even says match. Brilliant. That's it. So that's what we've got to do. In the actual test, though, you're only going to see 1 letter at a time. So you're going to have to remember the ones that came before it. So just like that, everybody nice and loud, we're going to start a test. So, take it away.
Yes. No. 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 Yes. Yes.
Nice. Not bad. Fairly straightforward, hey? Not too bad. So that's what we call 1 back. The test we did actually had 2 harder levels than that, which was 2 back and 3 back. And you might be able to guess, based off the name, that in 2 back, you're not guessing off checking the previous letter, you're checking 2 letters prior, and 3 back, 3 letters prior. So it gets pretty tricky. You can ask anyone that's done the test that it is definitely a test, that's for sure. Yeah, so what we've gone and done there, we've conducted the experiment, we can then bring it through to processing. And the first stage of this processing is to come and take our data and start cleaning it up. Basically because the device is quite sensitive. It's particularly sensitive enough to pick up things like movement, whether that's movement of the body, or more particularly movement in the eyebrows being quite intrusive, or even things like the breath or heartbeat in the signal. So what I've got here for you is just a small snippet of a signal. And in the red graph, in the red trace, we can actually see this oscillation up and down, and that's the presence of a heartbeat. although this itself does tell us one useful bit of information, that my subject was in fact alive during the test, which is good. Yeah, anyways, so what we can do is we can see that this is again just a snapshot of some raw data on the left, full of noise, heartbeats, bumps up and down, and we can take it through a few stages of processing, of filtering and averaging to end up with a much cleaner, friendlier looking signal like this on the right. And we can do that for all of our signals across all our participants, working towards a goal of extracting what we call a HRF, or hemodynamic response function. What this HRF is essentially a trace that contains the information of, it contains the behavioral response that someone's brain exhibits when presented with a stimuli, whether that's the onset of starting a task, like the little task I got you to do, or in this case, one person who's just participating in a rest period. This function is important because this is actually what we want to plot over the brain. We want to see what someone's response is when they start a task. So that can take us through to our final end goal. What we're working towards here is visualization. I'll bring those graphs back up in a moment. Actually not, I'll bring them up now. Let's go. So what we've got here, this is one snippet of a visualization. I've got the same response function here plotted. This is one of our subjects during a rest period, and this is just a 2-second snapshot into the response. And you can see in the graph on the left, it's the time period it is an example of is in the little square dotted box there. But I've made a video for this, so we can actually see as time goes on how the response changes on the brain against the graph. So take a look at this. There we go. So what we can see a couple of things here. We can see the activity changing around the brain, and we can also see that due to the warmer colours, that this subject was experiencing a decrease in oxygen. The cooler colours, sorry, this subject experienced a decrease in oxygenation over that test. Right, but this is all well and good. We've got one subject looking at one rest period, but what other things can we do? Perhaps another thing we could compare 2 different periods. So in this next slide, what I'm going to have on your right side up, no, your left, I guess, up here is a different subject undertaking a rest period, and on the right, they're going to be undertaking a test period. So we can compare the 2 videos side by side and see what oxygenation looks like during a test and during a rest. So, yeah, so that's it. So that's just a little 20-second snapshot. I've sped it up a couple of times for this. But what we can see is a few things. We see the warmer colors here during the during the test response, and that's evidencing the fact that there's an oxygenation increase over when we were looking at the rest period on the left. It's kind of handy. It allows us to do a few things. We can, without necessarily diving into looking at too many numbers and things, we can, once we've developed this system, we can look at brain activity on the surface level like this, just at quite a low level, which I think is really good. It's nice to be able to see things sometimes. But that begs the question. Why is this exciting for the future? What's the point of all this? So, there's a few good possibilities that could come, but let's look at the immediate future first. One potential thing we could do is integrate this method of visualization of data, looking at data that we've recorded in the past. We could integrate that with a live stream of data, allowing us to recreate these images as they occur, giving us a look into someone's mental activity as it's happening, which could be potentially useful. And looking into the future even further, that could have all sorts of applications. One could be, say, the development of a system looking at fatigue. So we could generate a system that analyzes someone's mental alertness, and it could potentially even give a warning to someone when their alertness drops below a certain level. Another thing we could do is create an interface between a computer and a brain. So we could set up a system that allows a brain to solely control some kind of device, not having to, just using this mental activity. One project I've seen is starting this year is another honours student is looking at creating a NERS brain activity controlled wheelchair. So these sorts of things have lots of different applications, whether it's more practical or more practical in the sense of doing something. Right. So gone through a few things there, but hopefully you can kind of see that with a little bit of setup work, we can actually take a snapshot of what someone's mental activity looks like, and with a bit of processing, we can actually overlay this on the brain and generate a nice image to look like, so you can see a nice image to look, so you can see what the activity looks like. But one thing I just want to leave you with is that if you think any of this sort of nerd stuff is quite interesting, I think there's a lot of stuff going on in the future potentially, so you might want to just watch this space. Thank you very much. If I could just spend one quick moment acknowledging everyone. So first of all, thank you to Dr. Hania Bakhshesh for her help and guidance throughout this project, and of course, Dr. Darren, Professor Ian, and Ravindu for little bits of help and insight along the way. Of course, the Faculty of Science and Engineering for making this possible, and definitely everyone within the Hive here. Wes, Carly, and Andrew, as well as all the other interns, have all been terrifically helpful. So thank you very much. Cheers.
Our last but not least presentation of the Hive Summer Internship this year is Yasmin Manahi. Her project has been supervised and conceived by Dr. Peter Buzzacott, who's in the audience here, who's from the Curtin University School of Nursing, also supervised by Niru Pereira, and supported by Wesley Lamont here from the Hive. This particular project has been supported financially by the Australasian Diving Safety Foundation and is titled Helping Developing World Diving Harvesters Avoid the Bends. Now, would you like to use the...
I can go away from it. That's fine.
Good.
No problem.
All right. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello. Good afternoon. Thank you all for attending. This is the last presentation of today. Thank you to all my Hive peers who are waiting, all of us, for this long. So my name is Yasmin Manahi. I just recently graduated with my bachelor's in architectural science last Saturday. And so I'm continuing into my study as a master's student. I also make art, and that's something that's a huge passion of mine. And as a result, I have a background in research and further design. I'm not a diver. I'm not a health science student either. And on top of that, I don't have a background in injury prevention. What I am, however, is an overthinker. And that's actually helped me quite tremendously in this project. This is my supervisor, Dr. Peter Buzzacott, who's in the audience today. As you can see, Peter is a diver, so good for the project. He's also got a background in health science and specializes in injury prevention. Peter, myself, alongside Wesley from the Hive, who's also here, the three of us worked on Project 26, helping developing region diving harvesters avoid the bends, a humanitarian project. So all of us are trying to reduce the number of decompression sickness cases in developing regions. Before I move into that, this is what decompression sickness looks like. Now, just a brief explanation of what decompression sickness is when our tissues get supersaturated with gas. Again, not a health science student, so I can't provide any more information than that, but this is what it looks like on the skin. The particular regions that we're looking at are Ninh Van and the Ly Son Island in Vietnam. Now, ideally, this project will be applied on a global level eventually, but these are the two primary islands that we're looking at studying. This is what our fishermen look like. So as you can see, very little diving equipment is available. They don't have access to basic things like a full wetsuit. Sometimes they may have fins. I learned that throughout my internship. So as you can see, the conditions are quite scarce. They come from quite low socioeconomic backgrounds, and as a result, this has proven a lot of challenges in diving practices that exist. Something that's really important is, given the socioeconomic status of our divers, is we need to make an intervention that's accessible. We came to the realization that we cannot have an intervention that has any monetary value. The reason for this is because these fishermen would then be able to sell them, thus not using the intervention. Second of all, it limits and gatekeeps knowledge. The knowledge on how to dive safely would then be restricted to the particular device that we provide. And so essentially you'll find that these safe diving practices will be limited to those who have the equipment to do so. So our key focus is to transfer knowledge, an intervention that did not require high literacy or education levels and had no monetary value. So we looked at safety cards. The irony behind it, though, is the research out there actually suggests very low understandability and comprehension rates of the document. Because of that, most of the research out there are actually trying to move away from safety cards altogether. Some other prevention strategies include videos and what they call serious games for safety education. What that is basically just a simple video game where users then participate by moving a character, and if they don't follow the instructions correctly, what you'll find is quite graphically, they will visually articulate the consequences of those things. This looks like heads being decapitated. It's quite gory and quite confronting, but in that study, the key finding is that these threat appeals are actually quite important in these safety interventions. Reason being is psychologically, we then feel more inclined to listen to whoever's telling us what to do because we don't want our heads to be decapitated. This here is an example of an airline safety card for our online audience. I also have physical copies that someone has stolen from several airlines, as you can see. So I would like you all to imagine that we're all on a plane together and we're all flying somewhere COVID-free. And as your air hostess today, I'm going to pass some of these documents for you to be able to see what I'm talking about. I'll probably give one to every row. There you are. So please feel free to have a look and pass these documents around. Do take a good look at these things, because what you'll find is within the documents, or throughout the documents rather, there are some similarities and also quite drastic differences. So unfortunately, the research out there is quite limited. Not many people have actually analysed why safety cards aren't very good at communicating. With one study I did find, however, they attributed it to these three keys: awkward perspectives, shifting scales throughout the sequence. Hopefully you'll be able to have a look and see some examples there for yourself. Absence of horizon line is also one of the really big features. Now, in this particular example, there is a horizon line in some of the drawings. However, if you look at this particular diagram, what's going on? Can anyone tell me? There's no horizon line to indicate where this person is. And as a result, as readers, we then struggle to understand where to put ourselves because there's no reference point. Despite this, however, back to our primary point about accessibility, these fishermen, for example, in Vietnam, they don't have access to these computers. Even if they did, they lack the digital literacy to be able to use these games, for example. So if we were to eliminate safety cards in general, then we'll be, again, gatekeeping knowledge and education, which is unethical. I'm not discrediting that there are definitely far better alternatives in the documents that you see currently. However, even though that's applicable for airline safety cards are used generally throughout a whole different range of contexts. So as a result, I came up with a criteria of the different things I need to include in my safety card. So as you can see with this very basic sequence, I ensured that throughout the sequence I maintained the scale of the diagram as well as the perspective. Additionally, I ensured that there was a horizon line so that a plane was possible, which allows us to, again, use that as a reference point. IKEA manuals. I'm sure we all have a piece of IKEA furniture in our house. So I looked at other instructional manuals to see how they communicate. And what I found is with Lego and IKEA, all of the drawings were drawn as axonometric diagrams. For those who don't know that, or know what that is, it's basically drawn on an axonometric angle, which allows us to understand space much better. Given the fact that with airline safety cards, the key communication is movement throughout a given space, this sort of diagram, an axonometric perspective, might be far more useful and comprehensible in understanding what messages the card is trying to communicate, opposed to the diagrams that we see. In front of you, you'll see that our diagrams are actually all drawn on the same axis. So there's a very difficult understanding there on what the space looks like. So what you'll find is that even though that axis is consistent, there have been efforts to try and improve the legibility of these documents. Now, I find it very interesting because you'll find that they ended up improving these graphics by making all the elements 3D, yet the plane is exactly the same. So they effectively made the wrong thing 3D. I did some testing on pictographs. Thank you to my lovely partner for modeling for me. So this is a photographic version of a sequence that I'm trying to communicate. I then created a pictographic version of the same document and what I call a hybrid, a combination of the two. So I tested these diagrammatic styles amongst my peers to see which proved to be most effective at communicating the message that I was trying to get across. Now, I will admit, I didn't have any ethics approval for this project at this stage, and so I was only able to get informal feedback during my tests. These were tested on my Hive peers, so everyone knows these documents. And what ended up happening is I found out that your perceived understanding is quite different to your demonstrated understanding. So in my questionnaire, one of my questions was to choose which they thought was most legible. And then for each document, I asked all of the participants to describe what was happening. And I found that with a lot of the responses, the one that they chose did not actually correspond to the one that they showed the most understanding of. That was a bit annoying to deal with because it wasn't straightforward. And so after some analysis, it was clear that the hybrid drawing was the one that was most successful. I would like to ask you, what is that? Knot, rope, bow tie. Okay. Cords. What do you think this is? Person. Okay, great. So now with the hybrid style drawing, it became evident that I needed to prioritize what exactly I was going to leave pictographic and what photographic. So using this example, it became clear that some icons were easily identifiable by the average person. We all relate to this stick thing universally, whereas something like this rope might be a bit more ambiguous. So because of that, this is where the overthinking happened. I started to then nitpick and try and figure out what elements am I supposed to keep pictographic and what photographic in order to best communicate my message. This left me with two safety cards that I wanted to make. One on prevention of decompression sickness and one on treatment. This is what I ended up coming up with in my first iteration. As you can see, it's pretty poor. it's quite awkward and difficult to understand to your average person. But I will also say that the key demographic that we're looking at will have a basic knowledge of diving. So I kept the boat here photographic, and I kept the seafloor photographic to make sure that you could identify the context and the setting. And then everything else was left pictographic. Now, the sequence that we're trying to illustrate is that the divers will throw a marquee that they have on board, overboard, go dive down, collect their catch, come up halfway, which is 9 meters below sea level, wait there for a period of time. This is the sequence where we articulate this time. Ideally, at 5 meters, you want to stay for about 3 minutes. However, that was a challenge to articulate because these people don't have watches and whatnot. So we advise them to take a look and observe their bubbles and wait until that reaches the surface. With this instance, we're trying to make sure that we are improving the situation, and it would be quite ignorant for us to think that we'll be able to completely resolve such a complex issue in Vietnam and these developing regions. Being there for any period of time would be enough, or far better than if they just keep rushing up to the surface. Following that, they ascend back to the surface, and during these times, we're just trying to ensure that they're not overtaking their bubbles as well. Something that we had to think about, I don't know if anyone's noticed, but there is a number 9 on the ship. So within these communities, there is a rumor that there might actually be a folklore that exists of a sea witch that exists in the trenches of the ocean. And the divers are actually afraid of this witch. So that's why they're returning to the surface as quickly as they are. So I did some research on international symbolism and symbolism for different contexts. And so I left a space here for there to be an opportunity to put a symbol on there to counter those suspicions. After some testing, and I got a range of different feedback from a range of people, I was able to create my first prevention document, which is what you'll see today. I don't want to go into in too much detail because I'd actually like to have these conversations with you guys when I do my demonstration to see what you think. However, I do want to note that this is a template. So marked red, you'll see that there are these boxes, and they are deliberately left open so that we can amend this document to suit the context of wherever we will be helping. I then made a treatment document, and as you can see, they correspond and they are quite harmonious with one another. It was quite important that with the treatment document, we had enough similarities because in future testing, we would like to use the 2 cards together, so one as a placebo of the other one that we're trying to test. This means I will hand over to Peter and the rest of my team for future testing once we have received ethics approval. So some limitations within my work is within the 10 weeks, I didn't have access to Vietnamese divers in particular. I didn't have access to sample sets that were reflective of my demographic that I was trying to target. And so as a result, I did work with my community. Education, age, cultural barriers are also very different. So once ethics approval has been received, the objective is that my documents will then get tested on the relevant people. I would like to say a big thank you to the Australasian Diving Safety Foundation for funding the project, as well as Jean-Eric Blateau from the French Navy for supplying the video that you saw earlier. Thank you to Dr. Peter Buzzacott, Niru Pereira, who's here today, Han Go, Senda Dov Chin, Wesley, Carly, Andrew, my fellow peers, the other interns today, the Curtin pre-crew team, thank you Paige for attending, and my lovely partner and model, Eddie. Thank you very much.
This really has been another very interesting year of projects. lots of different topics in all sorts of different fields, as you've seen in the presentations today. We're really blessed with some really innovative academics who've put forward some really interesting projects. We're very appreciative to the different groups who've provided funding to the scheme, and of course for the students who've done such a wonderful job with their projects. So let's put our hands together for Jade, Grace, Corey, Claudia, Harry, Samia, Mari, Rupert and Yasmin. The students are writing up reports, and those will be available as well. So if you're specifically interested in any of those reports, just reach out to us and we'll put you in touch. There's something that Archie just mentioned a few moments ago, which I've been meaning to say, is that many of these projects are very multidisciplinary in nature, marrying up coders or even non-coders with areas that aren't usually strong in coding, and all sorts of different aspects. So it really is good to merge together these different capabilities and skills into these single projects. And the other thing I often comment is that the students, having worked on this particular project and topic for 10 solid weeks, it's a lot of sort of time spent on one topic, and they have effectively become an expert in that little tiny field. So hopefully you'll be able to make use of that in your future careers. But this program is also intended to provide students with an insight and experience of academic research, and so hopefully they'll continue with that in their future studies. So thank you again. I'd also like to thank the Hive team, Carly, Daniel, Wesley, all been beavering away with equipment and technology and everything fighting against us. Thank you to those, and make a very successful program even more successful. Thanks again. Thanks for attending, and we'll be here same bat channel, same bat time next year for the next range of Hive internships. So thank you.